Good morning, everyone. We're just, as usual, waiting a moment while everyone comes in, and I think everyone is in, so we'll kick off. Good morning, or is it good afternoon now? Welcome to this morning's Conservation Council webinar, coming to you as always from Ngunnawal country. My name's Jonathan Curtis, and I'm joined by our guest this morning, Cris Brack, as well as Emily Shelley from the Con Council, who's kindly running things off screen as producer, which is very helpful. So, on to this morning's topic, Canberra's urban forests. I think probably one of the things that draws me to Canberra most is our forests, and I think it's one of our city's most recognisable characteristics. They were also a key part of the original garden city design. And here we are a century later. Our urban forests are not only beautiful, but critical to supporting biodiversity and critically providing shade in the future as we get a hotter and hotter city with climate change and reducing the urban heat island effect. But at the same time, our forests also face many threats, with mature trees reaching the end of their lives, increasing urban density, and of course, the impacts of climate change. So, what do we need to do to safeguard our trees? What do we need to do to get uh, to reach the 30% urban forest target that's in the ACT government's policy? Cris will help us explore these questions. Cris has decades of experience working on urban forests. He's an Honorary Associate Professor at the ANU Fenner School of Environment and Society, as well as the supervisor at the Canberra Arboretum. So, Cris, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. As usual, as we go through, please put your questions into the chat and then I'll group them and put them to Cris. If you put your questions in, it's really good because I know that we're talking about whatever is of most interest to you in the audience. So really do encourage you to put those in. Anyway, let's get into it. As a lead in, Cris, tell us about your history with trees. I gave a very snapshot intro of you, kind of a headline one, but what's your story?
Well, I have a very unusual story, is that when I was about 8, I decided I wanted to work with trees. So I designed my entire career to become a forester, working with trees and people. I lived in Sydney, which didn't have too many trees in those days. It was all western suburbs where I grew up. And I came to Canberra to study forestry. It was the only place you could do it at the time. And getting my degree, went and worked as a forester, which surprisingly took me to many places around the world. I wasn't expecting that. And then in 1990, came back to the ANU to start teaching and researching into forestry and natural resource management at the Australian National University. And one of my first big jobs for when I got back to Canberra was looking at the urban trees here in Canberra and helping the ACT government learn about their own forests and how to manage those. And that's been a wonderful, 30 years since then, delving into the urban environment and how trees and people and cities interact.
And you're also with the Arboretum. How long have you been involved with the Arboretum?
My colleagues there, particularly John Banks and I, submitted suggestions to the Arboretum, went way back after the catastrophic fires made it possible to do something there. And we put in some suggestions and have been involved right from the very start, watching all the dust billow up as they tried to plough the ground and plant the new trees. So that's been a wonderful experience too. There's actually the ANU Research Forest. That's my forest in the Arboretum. We were looking particularly how some of our eucalypt species manage to cope with drought and water restrictions, because the eucs are really quite clever beasties, and we're still working out how clever they are in terms of dealing with low water.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see how the Arboretum is sort of slowly maturing and coming together and seeing the design. Um, how would you sort of summarize the state of Canberra's urban forest at the moment? Where are we at?
It's, it's a complex question, um, because we're at different places at different times in the city, where the city's still expanding, and it's expanding into what used to be woodlands, grassy woodlands. So the natural tree cover is relatively low, but it's quite important, for a whole range of reasons. We're moving into that. And then the original city in north and south Canberra, the trees there are reaching, they're 100 years old, some of those ones. So they're reaching what we often call, useful life end. Um, because when we plant trees in cities, it's for a purpose. And when they start not delivering on that purpose, that's the end of their useful life. So we're expanding into areas that didn't have many trees, and we've got trees in the older areas that are needing renewal. And there's a whole bunch of trees in the Middle Ages which are still powering on fairly happily. So it almost depends on where you are in the city, depending on how good your trees are growing and whether or not they're still fulfilling the purpose that they were put in there for.
Have the purposes they were put in there for changed from the original designs? We're in a very different world conceptually to 100 years ago.
Yes, definitely they have. If you looked at yeah at the original designs, the Griffin designs for the city, trees were in there right from the beginning, and they had some quite strong, symbolic, um, representation. The mountaintops were all supposed to be native trees, and they planted native trees along the major avenues to sort of drag your eye into the hilltops. And so when you first entered Canberra, you had these native tree species and what have you. That was very strongly symbolic. But back then, we didn't know really how well Australian natives would grow in cities and whether or not they were safe to live around. So you find most of the suburbs then were exotics, because we had our history of European and North American planting. So let's just do that. It was safe. And that's evolved through time. Now you can almost tell which suburb you're in by how dominant the eucalypts. I joke that, Australia or Canberra became very patriotic in the 1960s because we started planting entire suburbs just in eucalypts. The whole Belconnen region, for example, is eucalypt. They still hadn't quite worked out which were the best ones, but eucalypts were Australian. We're going to plant eucalypts. So there's a bit of a change in our national philosophy there as well.
Were those original plantings, you mentioned the sight lines and so forth, how much in those original plantings did factors of biodiversity um, enhancement or protection or shade, for example, how much did they feature in that original thinking compared to where we're at now?
We have learnt more about, biodiversity over the last, century or so. But there is a conflict there to an extent, is that, it's a city for people, and that's its purpose. So it's almost, what's the natural, plant and animal in a city? Well, it's humans and probably rats are the natural things. So we can invite the other native animals and plants in, but again, it's whether they fit our current purpose. So cities are very much purpose driven. And to an extent, the social consciousness, the social planning has changed to say, well, it's not good enough just to have trees. We want trees that enhance the natural environment. So let's start planting these natural trees, or at least endemic to Australia, if not endemic to the actual local region, because now we start to talk about, there are only half a dozen tree species that were endemic to Canberra pre-European settlement, but that's too small for the diversity of the city now. So we've planted, there's quite a large number of eucalypts and other native Australian plants there as well. So we have changed our way of thinking, and we've changed what we think the city is designed for.
And when we talk about Canberra's urban forest. Have what's encompassed by that term? Obviously, nature strips, verges, private public land, or to use the correct terms, leased and unleased. Uh, what about the nature reserves? Are they excluded? I'm thinking Red Hill, Black Mountain, those things. Presumably, they're not covered by the term urban forest, although there are linkages.
They certainly are. There's some
Mm.
interesting terminology there. We talk about the streetscape, which are the at the front of all your streets. You have the mown parks, they're the highly maintained parks, and then the unmown parks, and they're all different types of the urban forest. And then you, of course, blend down into the national park, particularly down south. So Red Hill would be an unmown park, and certainly part of the ACT urban forest estate. They are treated quite differently to the mown parks and quite differently to the streetscape. We can also talk about planted trees versus natural trees. So Black Mountain is not planted, although there have been plantings in the past, but they're relying more on natural regeneration, natural regrowth, as opposed to the streetscapes, which are all planted. Your maintenance and what you expect from the parks or in the streets and the unmown parks and mown parks is actually quite different. The city expects different things, and people should expect different things in the unmown versus the mown versus the streetscapes.
Yeah. So presumably the objectives that you're working towards in those different categories and what you need to prioritize will vary according to obviously an unmown park like Red Hill is going to have a very different set of priorities and objectives and thus trade-offs compared to streetscape trees.
Yep. And again, we still have to really work out what the people, the residents, expect from those things. I mean, in the unknown park, Red Hill, Black Mountain, you expect to see snakes and native animals in there. In your streetscape, you don't.
Mm.
So we deal with things differently. They have to deal with these things differently. In the unmown parks, it's quite okay to have deadwood in the canopy, dead branches up in the canopy of a tree. This is very common for eucalypts. Most eucalypts will carry some deadwood. On the streetscape, that's okay if there's not a school or something like that around. So we have very different risk thresholds for those different things. And so the maintenance thresholds are also very, very different for the government.
So with the ACT Urban, I'll try to get the title right, the Urban Forest Strategy 21 to 35, I think it is has a target of an urban canopy target of 30%. Looking at the report to the Legislative Assembly urban tree canopy coverage of 2025, that sort of shows that we're at on average, I think it's a little under 22% at the moment. But rather worryingly, we seem to be going backwards. I think from memory, there are about 66 suburbs that have actually gone backwards a little bit, which is quite worrying in an environment where we need to increase our tree canopy, and also everyone's much more interested in it and concerned about it. What's going on there?
Well, again, it's one of those range of things that are affecting it. Some of the older suburbs are losing their trees because they're getting old and need to be replaced. And if you just do a one-for-one replacement, you lose a lot of canopy because big trees, mature trees have 100, no, sometimes up to 1,000 times the canopy area of a new planting. So to maintain the canopy area in those ones, you've got to plant an awful lot of trees just to maintain them, and then you've got to manage them up to maturity. We're moving into the newer suburbs, and they don't have the canopy to start with, so you're still planting young trees. But people are also getting more interested in things like solar panel, solar heating, that sort of stuff. So there is a little bit of a social rejection to having too many trees which are going to block their own solar access, particularly for solar panels and what have you. Some of the new suburbs out to the west of the Arboretum, for example, they're all mandated to have solar panels, which means you can't grow very big trees or you shade your own solar panels out. So there is a bit of a change in people's perception of the value of trees and how it's going to impact them. So in addition to that, so our older trees are getting older. We have come through a drought period, so the trees are stressed more, and there is a slight change in some of the desires for the people to have trees. I always come back to a very interesting study that was actually done in Perth, but I think is more general, is that people think the most valuable tree is the tree outside their neighbour's house. So don't block my front yard, don't block my driveway, block theirs, because it's good to have trees, but just not outside my house. So there is this bit of tension between having trees and having trees outside your own house.
I read in the report to the ACT Legislative Assembly that in terms of plantings on streetscapes, one of the most uh, one of the most common reasons for not planting was resident rejection, I think they called it. And what's happening there? Why in those new suburbs, which are so bereft of trees, it's really hard for me to understand why people would not want trees on their verges and trees providing shade and so forth.
It does come back to that. Is a lot of people think the verge in front of their house is theirs to do as they want. And that ranges from people who want to plant their own gardens out there, park their own cars and boats and visitor parking and what have you. And if you put a tree up there, you lose all that, as well as you have to maintain that tree and it shades your yard, for example. So there is a bit of that story behind that, is that if a tree goes out there, suddenly I'm responsible for it and I can't use that front as I might otherwise have wanted to use it. So there is a bit of, well, it's almost not in my front yard philosophy there. But part of that is, I think a lot of people don't realise what the trees do give them. There are some interesting studies out there that suggests, a well-placed tree in or around your property can actually add quite substantial, we're talking 10, 15% improvement in your property value. So there's some really powerful stories behind that if people actually understand that message.
Yeah, as well as the environmental effects of the cooling and so forth. That trade-off with the solar panels is an interesting one that I hadn't thought of, and is obviously a tricky one in those classic competing objectives. I'll just throw out a question from Jennifer. Looking at developments out in the new suburbs, can you comment on what steps the ACT government is taking to protect the mature trees and grassy woodland in those new development sites?
Oh, well, they have, the ACT has its tree preservation registers and things of that nature, so you can get them formally assessed and put on the register. I think the ACT government understands the value of a lot of these trees and how few we have and how important it is to maintain the heritage, that heritage. And then largely have to work with the developers to make sure there's enough protected area around those things and what have you. But sometimes it is very hard to protect a tree well. The area they need is often much more than you might expect, because the roots extend further and you've got to make sure you don't compact the soil and what have you. So it's not an easy task. It takes a fair bit of work, and you have to, protect a fair bit of area around those trees. But it can be done. But it takes quite a detailed planning exercise to protect those sorts of trees. And once they're on the register, hopefully that means that you've got some ongoing maintenance for them.
What when you say quite a large area, for a mature, let's assuming it's a mature eucalypt, thinking in terms of the radius of its above ground canopy, how does that correlate with its underground root systems?
Well, at the very least, the root systems tend to extend to the drip line, the outer edge of the tree canopy itself. And that's particularly useful, so that the leaves actually direct the water down there so that the fine roots can pick up the water. But you need to go a little bit further than that, because if there is water flow from the other areas, you have to make sure that flow is also maintained. So you need to know the water lines that support that tree, make sure that's not destroyed, or make sure you're not actually going to be washing too much fine material back into the tree as well. So the minimum is to the canopy dimensions, but you should go a little bit further than that, depending on if it's on very flat area, you're probably okay. But if there's any sort of slope or terrain variation, you've got to take into consideration how soil and water moves around that tree as well.
Steve's asked an interesting one, or drawn attention to the clash between, or the conflict between tree roots and all the services and underground infrastructure that goes in, and that must add a layer of complexity to the planning and management.
It's certainly, I mean, again, there's some fascinating research being done on that, how you can direct tree roots. It in the ideal world, you think of all that before you plant the tree, and you can have special engineering developments to make sure the roots are directed away from footpaths or away from the below ground stuff. But doing it retrospectively is quite difficult. So yes, there is. You've got to work out how you stop the cement being lifted on the footpaths and problems of that nature. So yes, it's expensive. And part of that is tree selection. Some trees are more aggressive, trees less so. Part of it's the problem with Canberra itself. We have a layer of clay not too far below the horizon, which is hard for roots to penetrate, so they go sideways rather than down. But a lot of that can be mitigated with good original engineering, how you build your streetscape. Do you have areas where water's collected? So rather than just have all the water run away very quickly off the streetscape, you can have swales and places where water is stored, and the trees can move their roots towards that rather than towards your footpaths and underground infrastructure. So yes, there's a lot of planning work in the new suburbs required. But the older suburbs, what you've got is what you've got.
Who's and this is a follow-up question from uh, Jennifer, I think. Who's responsible in those new developments for identifying those mature trees and putting them on the register?
As far as I know, anyone can suggest to the government to put them on, and the government will go and inspect them to see if it's worthwhile putting up. So there's a website on the ACT site. I can't tell you where it is at the moment, but you can ask for a tree to go up, and they'll go and inspect to see if it meets the criteria.
Yeah, okay. Question from Mitchell. What's the logic behind the removal of mature trees? For example, the eucalypts being removed on Drake Brockman and William Hovell. I think that's for the road duplications out there. Um, and how is it justified with offset planting? Because it's the obvious consequence, given what you said earlier about the canopy size of a mature tree, and it's going to take decades, many decades, to reach the same thing. It would seem to be a recipe for uh, going backwards on Canberra's tree canopy for the next few decades, anyway.
And that's right. So if you take out a big tree, there is a loss to the community, there's a loss to the environment. But it was only last year they've updated their tree removal permissions and what have you. And so what they're actually doing now is they're looking at what was the canopy you've removed. So what's the canopy area that's gone? And how quickly can you replace that canopy? And the longer it takes to, there's a financial incentive to replace that canopy faster than slower. So if you can plant 10 trees in the same location, the canopy comes back relatively quickly. If you can't plant it in the same location, then you have to justify planting them somewhere else. So there's now a hierarchy of planting more trees in the same location or relatively same location. And then there's to get the canopy back up to where it was. And if it takes too long, there's a financial contribution you've got to make to support planting in other areas as well.
It's interesting. Just on, it's a neat segue from looking at the offset plantings. The question from Michelle is the use of the plastic guards in replanting, and are there alternatives to putting all that plastic everywhere? Cardboard fortified with plant-based plastics or something? What else can we do?
There was an honours research project 2 decades ago at the ANU where the student was actually looking to see what the effect of the guards were and what the different types of guards could do to help. Should they be solid? Should they be have holes in them for the wind to flow through? Did the colour matter? And
Yeah.
the results were really quite interesting, but not straightforward. The guards are useful. Any sort of guard appears useful. Some of the different colours may actually be useful because they reflect different wavelengths back and forth. Many of the guards are not sufficient to actually stop browsing. So you need quite large guards to stop that. That study didn't look at, plastic versus cardboard. It did look at core flutes and things of that nature, but I think the idea was there was a time when you should go and remove the guards. So you shouldn't just let them rot in place. So in response to the question, plastic's probably not a great idea, but it does certainly last longer than the cardboard ones.
One of those lesser evil.
That's right. But if you go back to the idea that you have to take it away within a year of it going up or what have you, but also the guard should be related to what you're trying to protect against. Is it just wind damage? Is it browsing? Because they're quite different guards you need for those different things.
Yeah. Thomas has asked, how are we going to reach and maintain the target 30% tree canopy? And the question goes on, and I think he talks about the removal of mature trees and grasslands, which we've covered. Before we get to looking forward and how we get to that 30%, I'm interested in exploring some of the kind of the major threats or challenges to the existing tree cover. Urban clearing and removal of mature trees and grasslands is obviously one of them, which we've touched on. What else keeps you awake at night on when it comes to threats to the urban forest?
Well, the urban environment is quite harsh for many trees, particularly the Canberra one, because our soil is not particularly deep, and Canberra suffers the old engineering problem that water is bad, so the idea is to get rid of it as fast as you can. So the trees are already tend to be in a moisture-stressed environment. And the climate change story is suggesting that's going to be worse. So that's going to be an ongoing problem for our street trees and our planted. Well, street trees more so than the unplanted estate, the unmown estate to an extent. So there is that ongoing problem. There is an ongoing problem with human attitudes and how that changes. Canberra seems to have people who either love eucalypts or love exotics, but it's often one or the other. I think the other one is messy. It's interesting. They think the exotics are messy because they dump leaves all the time in autumn, and other people think the eucalypts are messy because they dump bark all year round. So it's an interesting combination. So to an extent, we have to get the people on side first, and let them realize that trees are dynamic living things. They have needs, but they also have a huge number of benefits for society. We've quantified some of those benefits. As a city, we save millions of dollars on heating and cooling because of the trees. We save millions of dollars every year because they improve the water flow, our storm event control, that sort of stuff. They actually give us quite a fair income in tourism. We've just finished the autumn tourism season. People come from around Australia to visit our colourful leaves because we're the only city that really that does that to a great extent. So I think if people could start appreciating the values of the trees and seeing that they are living dynamic things that need care, that I think the biggest thing, and not knowing that is the biggest threat.
Just going to the issue of the soils and water and so forth, I want to explore a bit something you touched on in an earlier part of the conversation about um, how you can use engineering works, essentially creating swales and so forth, to improve surface water flows and then reducing the impact of impermeable surfaces. How that, I suppose, generally known as water sensitive urban design, how good are we at that? And where in Canberra would I be able to see best practice rain gardens, water sensitive urban design, those swales, yeah, getting away from the old curb and guttering stuff that is really about just collecting and transporting water off-site, which is not really very helpful if you're in a in a desert, effectively.
Well, I don't know where the best touring area is. I mean, there's that, as you said, there's a lot of places where we've been retrofitting the stormwater drains and stormwater, turning them back into wetlands, which has been a big improvement, both for the stormwater maintenance, but also for the biodiversity. But the little things that is not quite so obvious, on the curb and guttering, you see there's a drain, and normally that drain just pumps you straight into the stormwater system, which and then just dumps it into one of those stormwater drains. But it's quite easy, and I'm not sure how often this is done in Canberra. It's done in another cities, where that drain on the streetscape actually first goes into basically a well. This is basically a big hole in the ground, which can then fill up with water, and then the water can gradually permeate through the soil. If it gets totally full up, then it diverts back into the stormwater system. But it's collecting the first, quantity, 100 litres or so, into a hole, which is then allowed to distribute itself into the subsoils and what have you. So they don't look that much different from the surface, but it's just a little bit of extra engineering work when they put them in. And there's been quite good success with that. It then, because it goes into the soil and dissipates out, the tree roots are attracted down rather than sideways as well. So there's a good advantage to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I noticed in some overseas jurisdictions, there's really widespread use of permeable surfaces for car parks and all sorts of things to really increase the amount of water that seeps into the soil rather than simply being washed off. But I'm not aware of any of that in Canberra yet.
Well, I mean, we have our 30% canopy cover target, but we also have a 30% permeable surface layer target. So that's in the target. So they're looking at that as well.
Oh, that's good. I wasn't aware of that. With the other really, and I struggle with this um, and the trade-offs involved with the increased urban density. So, and it's sort of quite a vexed question in Canberra at the moment as we pursue the sort of transport-oriented design and the densification along the public transport routes and all those good things. But I'm also mindful that that same development is often happening in the older suburbs with the mature trees. Is there a way that you can still maintain the density of canopy whilst having the higher urban density with all its advantages for sustainability?
The- Well, yes, there are. I mean, some of the early designs for high-rise buildings was that you would take the land area normally associated, say, with 20 houses, but build those 20 houses straight up over the land area of two houses, and then you've got eight land houses around you to turn some of those into parks. So the high density is relative to where you put an apartment block in, but you should then also have some surrounding areas that are still green, grass and treed and what have you. And you can have an improvement, both the density increases because you can put 10 apartments up, but still now have 2 or 3 full green spaces around it. So you still doubled or tripled your intensity, but you've also doubled or tripled your green area because you're not wasting so much in a standard suburban house block. So there are ways of doing that, but it means when you're developing a property, you've got to look beyond just the property boundaries. You've got to look at the region as well. So up the canopy of those. I do now live in a high density place, so there's my just warning. And we've been asking the government to consider not just the canopy cover, but the canopy cover per resident. So you can see what's happening in that too, just to make sure you don't, take out, too much. The residents in these high density places also need access to green space, and they need access to green space within walking distance.
Thanks. Thanks, guys, for all the questions that are coming through. There's some really interesting ones, and I'm struggling slightly to keep up with them all. So, apologies in advance if I miss any of them. Just one from Mitchell. Could we please get the details of the tree guard efficacy study that Cris mentioned? Cris, I'm sure you could. We'll probably do this out of session, but we
Yeah.
can. I can get the details of that, and we can send them out to everyone if that's all right, Cris.
Yeah, I take that when I noticed it was a while ago, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. Yep.
and lots of question from Gordon. To balance the loss of trees with densification, should we be putting in dense microforests in our neighbourhood parks? And I was going to ask about this because I've seen some fantastic videos about is it Miyazaki or those microforests and that methodology for really turbocharging a high density forest in a very quick time.
Those microforests are quite fascinating. But again, you have to remember what your purpose is. I mean, they're quite unnatural if you're talking about, not human involvement. But that's okay, because if your reason is to pull people back into these forested environments, highly diverse environments, and attract the animals into a highly heterogeneous environment, they're really valuable. So yes, they have a real purpose. It's not a natural purpose, and it's a really good thing, I think, for an urban estate, which also is not natural. So yeah, I think that there are some great things. They're not the answer, but they're certainly part of an answer, I think, and they really enjoy. I really enjoy seeing them take off. And that's one of the things I think is important, again, for urban dwellers, is that so often we can't see the environment changing around us. And that's part of the problem. You don't see the slow change So there's people, you know, what the average residential time in any house in Canberra is 5 years. And if you have a tree at the front of your house, in 5 years you don't notice any change. So you don't realise that it's alive and living and growing and what have you. But those little microforests, in 5 years, you will see a change and you can start to appreciate how lively these things are. Sorry, if you hear in the background, my cat's decided it wants to join in. Just a second.
There's always room in a webinar for a cat or a dog. So keep
Sorry
those
about that.
coming,
Yep.
everyone, and we'll keep working through them. I won't always get to them in order because I try to group them while we're on a particular subject. One from, excuse me, another one from Mitchell. Isn't there an available table of dates specifically for the ACT when each species of exotic deciduous trees drops its leaves and later goes back into leaf? Because this would help enormously with planning plantings for solar access and to maximize that solar access as the sun moves lower in the sky in autumn. Because as he makes the obvious point now, I think of it that the sun in the hot periods is traveling right over the top, typically in a way that uh, at exactly the same time that you also want maximum canopy coverage, but the canopy is less likely to obstruct in summer if the sun is passing on those sort of high angle ones trajectories.
That's an interesting. I don't know. Well, I don't know of any document which says these. This is when the this is where all the exotics drop leaves and what have you. There are two ways the exotics know when to drop leaves. The deciduous trees know when to drop leaves. Some of them just do it on day length. When the days hit a minimum length, they said, right, that's time. Shut over into the autumn. And others of it do with temperature. So the temperature and rainfall will tell them when to shut down. So that's the temperature and rainfall ones are interesting because we know that is changing. So they are now doing both bud burst and leaf drop has changed in Canberra. It's only by a few days on average, but it is changing. So that would make that story a bit more complicated. And yes, you can um, you can place your trees at different orientation around your house to maximise the shade effects and what have you. If you plant on the south side of your house, it's not going to shade your house. It might shade your neighbour's house, so you might have to talk to your neighbour about that. If you plant trees to the west of your place, particularly now, you'll want to pick trees with leaves that drop the vertical oriented leaf because they'll then stop the western sun. But you can have different leaf orientation and plant that. So if you look at its interesting species, they have different architecture, both of the branches and of the leaf pattern, and you can optimize that for your property if you've got enough room to plant in your property. Any of the newer properties that gone are the good old days of the half-acre block with a little house and 2 or 3 trees in the backyard. But still, there are ways of doing that if with what room you've got. I mean, shrubs can shade your house too. They're nowhere near as effective as a tree, and they don't shade the roof so much. So you can also do that with shrubs. But I like trees. Trees are so much better.
So do I. Let's shift focus to the future and in particular the implications of the changing climate. We know from the risk assessments and modelling that we can expect Canberra to get hotter on average, hotter and drier, but at the same time, we may also be subject to more severe storms, more the rain that does arrive will arrive all at once in possibly very destructive ways. What are you thinking about how we adapt our species selections, the way we plant and manage trees in the ACT to cope with what is unfortunately going to be a pretty hostile environment.
That's right, and I think one of those big things is that problem of the fewer rainfall events, but more severe rainfall events. And so managing that rainfall, those severe rainfall events, is an issue. So there's two things we want to talk about: how do the trees survive the changing climate, and secondly, how the trees can help the city in that changing environment. So literally, we've just published a paper last couple of months ago looking at how the different crown architecture actually does different things for cooling the city, and when it cools the city. So you need to cool your city in midday when people these days aren't out, or is it more important to cool it in the afternoons? So you have different architecture of the trees can do that. So you can start to select your trees based on their canopy and leaf architecture to maximize the cooling at different points in time. You can also optimize the depth of the canopy. Do you prune lower down, or do you not prune lower down? That sort of stuff to improve air movement through the canopy, which has an impact on that. So there's some really interesting studies on picking the tree species to most help cooling. You want to pick tree species that slow down the rainfall penetration. So if rain hits a canopy, it takes it a little while to actually penetrate the canopy and then come down onto the ground. And if you've got the right canopies, you only need to slow that down by 20, 30 minutes. And the peak rainfall events get spread that much further, which reduces the impact of those stormwater events. So there's a lot of study now working on what tree architecture is best, and then plant those species. But then you walk over to which trees are going to survive the best. That's why it'd be worthwhile going down and looking at the research forest at the Arboretum, because the eucalypts basically have two responses to lack of water or overheat. You either lack of water, you are what's called a drought avoider. You just have really, really powerful root systems and you get any water that's there and you just keep growing. Or you're a drought tolerator. When the drought's not there, you basically hibernate. You shut the tree down, you close your leaves off, you close your stomata, and you just wait out the drought. So that's basically the two major responses. There's a whole bunch of other things they can do, but that's basically you tolerate it or you avoid it. If you avoid it by having these really good root systems, you tend to grow really, really fast, or you die. That's if the drought's too bad, that's the end of you. Whereas the tolerators tend not to grow as fast, but they do tend to survive better. So you have a trade-off. Yeah. We know a lot of the mechanisms of how these trees respond, and we've actually been mapping the trees are growing in Canberra, and some of our species now not growing as big a canopy as we had expected, and we think that's their trees' response to the last 20 years of poorer weather conditions. They're not growing as tall as we had expected, so some trees are responding by just changing their growth patterns to cope with it. And other species are just carrying more deadwood because they've grown and grown, and then they just shed the leaves and the branches because they can't cope with those anymore. So do you want a big tree with some deadwood in it? Tree doesn't care having a bit of deadwood. Biodiversity, that's actually good having a bit of deadwood in the crown. But if it's outside of school, that's not a worthwhile risk. Outside your house, maybe it is. So there's a lot of trade-offs between you want your tree to grow and shade everything versus what you're prepared to take as a risk about some deadwood in the canopy.
Speaking of things falling, not just deadwood, as a member of the volunteer with the SES, I'm very aware of the other thing that trees do when we have a severe storm is they fall over on things, and I always am just devastated when we lose so many trees in these big storms. Presumably, some trees are a lot better at standing up in a storm than others. Is that something we think about? Or is that more a question of where we plant them and how we plant them?
To an extent, I mean, the reason trees fall over, it's either because the ground has failed, the roots are all still there, but they pick up the whole root plate and the
Mm,
whole thing falls over, or the roots are snapped. So you can have root failure or ground failure. Most of the things I've seen in Canberra tend to be ground failure because, again, we've got fairly shallow soils over clay and the roots can't get down so they reach out into that soil, but the whole thing can peel up. That's got some advantages because when it's ground failure, the trees tend to lower themselves down. They don't subtly fall over. So, you have a chance to hear it go and get out of the way so that people very rarely are injured by a tree falling on them. The injuries tend to be the tree's fallen across the road and you haven't noticed in time and then you run into it.
mm,
So that's the sort of thing. So trees falling, yeah, it's a problem, but it doesn't often cause as much damage as you might expect when this tree comes down because they lower themselves down rather than just collapsing on you.
mm.
Yeah, so you
Although,
should.
although we might still lose those mature trees um, and we are likely to have, as part of the climate change, we are likely to have those with the more severe storms, increased wind strengths with those. Is it true to say that um, where trees are more densely planted and they have the support of others, they're less prone to being blown over? It would, on the face of it, would seem logical than isolated trees that are trying to do the whole thing themselves.
Well, yes. If the tree has grown and isolated from seedling, they tend to, they know about wind, they respond to the wind, and they have a good root system, so they're pretty safe. If they're in a forest with lots of other trees, and they're still in a forest with lots of other trees, they're also reasonably good. The trees you have to watch out for, particularly, is if they were in a forest and you've thinned it out. So if you've got a street with 100 trees in them, and then suddenly someone takes out every third tree or every second tree for another reason, the residual trees are at risk because they're used to having neighbours helping them fight the wind, and now they don't. So
Mm,
that thinning or that change, you can even do it with a building. They've had a building next to them and you've taken the building down. That tree is now subject to a whole different wind pattern it hasn't seen before. And its root systems probably aren't adapted to that wind pattern, so they're now at risk. Yeah, so we can pick trees that are at risk, and the wind throw is often as the trees above ground environment change dramatically, or have you destroyed its root system by running a road path next to it and broken down some side of it.
Um, Barbara's asked, where can we find information about your research forest? And where is it? Is that something that we can actually visit at the Arboretum?
Yeah, it's down the south part of the Arboretum, so it's behind a lock gate, those road networks down there, so you can only walk to it.
Mm.
So it's two eucalypt species down there. So there is information. If you go to the village centre, they've got information there on that research forest down there. Or you can even buy the Arboretum book, which has got all the details in there as well. But
Gordon's asked, which native tree species will adapt the best to Canberra's changing climate that we should be planting now, which is possibly one of the questions your research forest is looking at.
well, the research forest is looking at the eucalypts, particularly how they change their mechanisms. We have done a whole bunch of the ACT government asked us to think about what species are best. Now, one of the issues we have is that you don't want too much homogeneity in a city. More than half of our trees are eucalypts. Now, if something attacks eucalypts, then we lose half our trees in one fell swoop. So you do need a diversity. You also need to work out what you're planting in. Is it a laneway? Is it a park? Is it a soccer field? Is it a backyard? What have you? So there's no simple answer. That
Mm.
being said, there are over 800 species of eucalypt around, so there's probably a eucalypt you can find to fit in somewhere. But we've got other species. Brachychiton's another really useful tree. It's going to suit an awful lot of Canberra. It's a native tree, so it can do an awful lot of things, and it looks like it will cope quite happily with the climate we're predicting for the future. Um, if you want to go for natives, as I said, there's quite a few natives around there, but you can also still go for exotics. There are some exotics which can cope quite happily with the future Australian conditions. The plane tree, some people hate the plane tree, some people love the plane tree. It survives well in cities. It will survive very well in Canberra's future. Unless you are allergic to the seed pods and the seed for the plane tree, and then you'll hate it. So again, it's horses for courses. Plane trees are big. You don't want to plant them in a laneway, but you can plant them on streetscapes and parks. They have a very showy foliage, and they will survive. So they're quite good. Animals will use them. Birds particularly do use plane trees. So you can't say exotics are not healthy for their environment. They can be. So again, if you particularly want to support some animals, there are some species that are better for it. But you just have to make that trade-off. But yeah, we've got a list we've given to the ACT government of something like 150 species, which will probably survive in Canberra, which in different circumstances, and about half of those are native.
Okay, we've got time for one last question, and Andrew's asked what I think is the perfect wrap-up question. What priority changes would you like to see in how the ACT government manages the urban forest? What's top of your wish list?
I get people active and involved in their streetscape and their park. I think we need people to appreciate that the trees are good for them and that they can help those trees, and it's giving advantage to them. The way Canberra was built, it's too expensive for the government just to maintain the trees. I mean, originally we were built because the Commonwealth government was going to maintain our treescape, and we planted all that, and now we can't do it. It's expensive to maintain them. But I think really, if we can get the residents just doing a little bit and appreciating the value of the trees, I think that's going to be a really valuable part for our treescape.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, as Peter Cundall used to say, and people of a certain age will recognise the reference, that's your lot. Cris, thanks again for taking the time to join us today. I really enjoyed the chat, and to all of those in the audience, thanks for joining us as well. And thanks for all the great questions. Trees are very dear to my heart, as I'm sure they are for many of us, and we could probably chat on all day. Uh, I hope to see you all for future webinars. Our next one is going to be on the 24th of June, where Simon Copeland, the Executive Director of the Con Council, will give a briefing on what's in the ACT budget, which I believe is being released on the 10th of June. We've got lots of other more interesting, not other, more interesting speakers. We've got lots of interesting speakers coming up as well. Don't tell Simon I made that mistake. Keep an eye out for details in the Yellow Box newsletter. Also, if there's something you would like to see a webinar on, please flick an email to the Conservation Council and let us know, and we'll put it on the list, and we'll try to find a speaker. Or if you have a good idea for a speaker, let us know that as well, and we'll work it into the program. So much really interesting and important stuff we can be covering. So I'll wrap up there. Cris, thanks again, and have a great day. Keep warm. See you all next time.
Thank you.